evening, everyone. Thank you for listening in this evening. We're going to continue marching along in our lessons about the Bible. The big picture is what we are calling it. And now we are past the divided kingdom. And so this puts us, historically speaking, into the time period of the exile, which lasted 70 years, and the return. Now, we're going to do two lessons. They're actually not in chronological order. Um, Esther, we're going to look at that book next week, and we're going to focus on Ezra and Nehemiah this week. There's actually, it's difficult to do it in chronological order because there's some overlap in between with the books, and even the books themselves, Ezra and Nehemiah. And the old, in this Hebrew translations, the ancient translations, are actually just one book, and they, as Ezra and Nehemiah, and they take place over several years. And then Esther takes place actually before then, leading up to these times. So we're gonna keep on going with that idea. What we have is Cyrus the Great was a very powerful king who was the one who established the Persian Empire and defeated the Babylonians in the year 539 BC. Now, if you were to try to figure out where these countries are today, where these empires were today, most of the empires that we have looked at, in fact, all of them that we have looked at, um, leading up to this one, are all in the Middle East. Now, later on, the Greeks will march in and take, to conquer the Promised Land through Alexander the Great, and a lot of wars will arise from there. And then the Jewish people will win their independence under the Maccabees, which we do not read about in the scriptures. We read about in history, which is in between the Old and the New Testament. But then the Romans will march in and conquer Palestine and destroy eventually, because they rebel. The Jewish people rebel against Rome. Eventually, Jerusalem will be destroyed, and the temple will be destroyed one final time. Well, that's besides the point. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. We have Cyrus the Great, and if you were to look on a map and try to figure out where his empire was, it would be in the nation of Iran today. In fact, Iran, from what I understand and have been able to gather, is actually the remnants of the Persian Empire. Um, Interesting. I've heard people say that. It's interesting that that is a thing, because they don't have an emperor and or anything like that, but it's been continuous until I guess until Islam took over, and they just kept shrinking and shrinking until they became the nation that we call Iran today. Babylon was in the nation that we call Iraq. In fact, the former dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, believed that he was Nebuchadnezzar reincarnated, and he tried to pass that propaganda on to his subjects, I guess, if you want to call them that. So a lot of things happening in the time period of these folks in the Old Testament scriptures. We also have a lot of news that has come out of those nations in the same region over the last 30 some odd years, and continues to one degree or another, less than it has in the most recent years. But Cyrus was the first emperor of the Persian Empire. Again, he defeated the Babylonians, who had just defeated Judah. He defeats the Babylonians in 539 BC, and he was a great king. He stopped the practice of deporting people away from their nations and their homeland, as we had seen with the Assyrians and obviously with the Babylonian empires. In fact, not only did he stop this, he reversed it, and We also know that not only did he reverse this, he actually financed the return of many of his defeated subjects with money from the Persian treasury. Um, there's actually a famous edict that Cyrus made on the international policy of returning people to their homelands. It was in 538 BC. So 538 BC, he makes a proclamation. Only a few months after the fall of Babylon, he reverses the trend of Assyria and the kingdom that he had just conquered. I'm actually looking at a picture of what is known as the Cylinder of Cyrus, which was imprinted way back then, 538 BC, which in Persian declares people are now to go home. Now, as with all of the other nations that have been conquered, the Jews, as we remember, had been dispersed among many nations, but now they are allowed to go back home. Interesting enough, 150 years before Cyrus does this, the prophet Isaiah actually says that this was going to happen in Isaiah 44, verses 28 through Isaiah 45:1. He actually, 150 years before Cyrus was even born, identifies him by name and said that he would be the rebuilder of Jerusalem, which, of course, at that time, Jerusalem had not been destroyed, and the people did not think that they would ever see the kind of trouble that they eventually saw. Now, of course, the people in Isaiah's day did not. It would be their descendants in a few generations that would see this problem, but they couldn't imagine a time that God would send them away from the promised land. That edict of Cyrus that I was telling you about, that I'm looking at a picture of here, the cylinder that was in clay, is actually recorded in the closing verse of 2nd Chronicles. So if you want to turn to the last chapter of 2nd Chronicles, last verse, you'll see it in English, what is actually on the cylinder of Cyrus. It's also in the opening verses of Ezra. So those two things, 2nd Chronicles 36, 22 through 23, and Ezra 1 through the first part, at least, of the 3rd verse, are almost identical. It's easy to think, we just finished 1st and 2nd Kings. We didn't really cover 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but it's easy to think that 1st and 2nd Chronicles would fit better with 1st and 2nd Kings, since they tell virtually the same story, only from completely different perspectives. However, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are really the prequels to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, because these books were actually written after the exile. It's actually believed that Ezra wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles as well, because they explain why God allowed Judah to be destroyed and its citizens exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. So it gives you a perspective of it coming and looking back, where 1st and 2nd Kings doesn't really give that final perspective. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah pick up on that same theme and show how God restored his people through the emperor of Persia by the name of Cyrus. And of course, Esther's story actually takes place, like I said, there's overlap. We'll get to Esther next week, but it actually takes place between chapters 6 and 7 of the book of Ezra. Ezra and Nehemiah, as I said earlier, were actually one book at one time, and they were contemporaries of one another. Ezra served as a priest, and he was helping the people be restored spiritually speaking. Nehemiah was governor of Judah, and he was in charge of restoring the infrastructure of Jerusalem. And so the account begins 80 years before either of them even set foot on Jerusalem soil, under the leadership of a man by the name of Zerubbabel. That's kind of a weird name. It's spelled Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel was actually the first person that is being dealt with in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. His accomplishment is the temple that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 70 years prior to that was rebuilt. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. And that takes place between 538 and 516 BC. Then you have Ezra, and Ezra 7 through 10. And he actually comes on the scene in history 458 BC when he's an adult doing the work that he was meant to do there in Judah, back in Jerusalem. His accomplishment was that he helped, as we said earlier, the restoration of God's people. And then Nehemiah comes about 14 years after, so there's overlap in history with Ezra and Nehemiah. And Ezra, or Nehemiah rather, actually, as we said earlier, his accomplishment for the God's people was to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. So the edict, once again, the Edict of Cyrus puts Zerubbabel in a very difficult position of trying to lead God's people in what is now a barren wasteland. There has not been anything happening there for 70 years. It's lied fallow, and of course, we know what lying fallow means. There's there's going to be a lot of work for them to be able to get the land back under control. But God allowed His people to return back to their homeland after 70 years of Babylonian captivity. Even though God allows them to do it, most of them don't accept. They stay. Even though Cyrus himself was being very generous, most of the Jewish people were still very happy staying where they found themselves. When you think about that, 70 years have passed, so all of the adults that were taken are dead. Most of the young people that were taken, let's say you're 10 years old when you're taken into captivity, now you're 80. It's too old to move back home, more than likely. Some people would do it, but not very many would do it. You made a life for yourself wherever your captors took you. There are people that have businesses. There are people that have built homes as God instructed them to do because they were going to be there for a long time. If you were less than 10, you're still going to be in your 70s, and you're not going to remember your homeland. You've had a family, built a life for yourself. If you were born much after that, you never knew Israel to be your home. And so a lot of people just didn't see the point in going back to their homeland. A lot of folks think that that's a sad thing, but really we can understand. If we put ourselves in their shoes, we can understand exactly where they're coming from. We probably wouldn't want to go back to that place either, or go there for the first time, as many of them would have had the opportunity to do. Because, and not only do people have their families and their lives and their businesses in Mesopotamia and Persia, as they had been dispersed, Jerusalem was still in ruins. Been burnt 70 years prior, nobody had gone in to fix anything. So who in their right mind would even want to go there? That's what some people probably thought. And in fact, only about 50,000 of them did go back to Jerusalem. Those that did were considered heroes by their fellow countrymen. It was a long trip, and even though you may have made the trip, once you get there, there's no guarantee that you're going to be successful. Because of those very difficult living conditions that you were going to have to face. But those who did return would rebuild the temple under the leadership of Zerubbabel. At least they would start rebuilding it, because they were not able to finish its construction. In fact, at first, all they were able to do was to lay the foundation of the temple, which took place in 536 BC. You can read about that in Ezra chapter 3, verse 1, through Ezra chapter 4 and verse 5. There was a fella, a neighboring Persian governor that had been established by the empire. His name is Tatanai. Actually meddled in the affairs of the Jews that had returned, and work on the temple would not resume until 520 BC. And you can read about the resumption of the temple work in Ezra chapter 4 in verse 24. So for 16 years after they had returned, because of this Persian governor who's causing trouble, all the Jews were able to do under Zerubbabel at first was to lay the foundation of the temple, the very beginning. They couldn't do anything more than that. In Ezra 4:24, we are introduced to Haggai, Haggai, or Haggai, probably is more like how you pronounce it, and Zechariah, who are actually prophets that write two books towards the end of the Old Testament scriptures. Read about them in Ezra chapter 5, verses 1 through 2. And they encourage the people to get back to work. And so Zerubbabel actually responds to their message and resumed efforts to construct the temple. And then that same governor, Tatnai, I think it's Tatnai or something like that, was still in office. It was 15 years earlier. So he sends a letter to the new king, King Darius, demanding that the Jews stop building the temple. You read about that in Ezra chapter 5, verses 3 through 17. However, the king, this is great, I love this. The king, however, wrote back to Tatnai and said that not only did the Jews have the right to rebuild the temple, because that's what Cyrus had told them they were able to do, that was law. He was meddling in Persian law, which was a big deal. And we'll figure more about that when it comes to Esther, and also when we look at Daniel. We may not get a chance to look at Daniel too much, but he didn't mess with the law in Persia. That would come with a pretty serious offense. But the king Darius the first writes back, said not only did they have the right to rebuild that wall because it was Persian law by Cyrus the Great, Tatnai was going to actually help them pay for it because of the trouble that he had put them through. Ezra chapter 6, verses 1 through 12. And so therefore, Zerubbabel took 5 years to build once the foundation. After the foundation, there was 15 years in between the foundation and the construction process resuming, and then it took 5 more years. So the temple was actually completed in the year 516 BC. There's actually been 3 temples of Israel. The first one, of course, was Solomon. Before the temple of Solomon, you had the tabernacle that God had commanded Moses to construct. And then, after that, of course, it was destroyed in the year 586 BC. It was built in 957 to 950, so it took 7 years to build the first temple, and it was destroyed not quite 400 years later, or about 370 years, somewhere in there, give or take a few years. It was destroyed 370 years later. So that building stood for 370 some odd years. And then afterwards, Zerubbabel, as we've been talking about today, comes and he starts building it in 536. He and the Jews that come back start building in 536 BC, and then they resume after Tatnai gives them fits in 520, and they finish in 516. That temple was also destroyed in the year 63 BC by the Roman general Pompey. And then the third and final temple was constructed by Herod the Great, and this took forever to build. They started building it in 20 BC, so 20 years before Jesus was born, and they finished construction on it in the year AD 64, which was 30 some odd years after Jesus had resurrected from the grave. Now, there's a lot of implications that we could think about that. I don't want to get into it right now, but there's one thing I want you to think about. It was finished in the year AD 64. Remember what happens in the year AD 70. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed, as Jesus predicted it would be in Matthew 24. 6 years later, it took them about 85 years to build that temple, and it only stood finished for 6, because it was destroyed by the Roman general Titus, who would actually later become an emperor himself, if my Roman history doesn't fail me. Now, many of the older Jews, let's go back to Zerubbabel's temple. Many of the older Jews had personally seen the first temple before it was destroyed by the Babylonians. So some of those older ones did, like we talked about, some of them did go back home. And they remembered what the first temple looked like before it was destroyed by the Babylonians. And I encourage you, if you have access to the internet at this time, I encourage you to get on there and look up. You go to Google and look up Solomon's Temple, and you'll find artist depictions. Solomon's Temple is one of the ancient wonders of the world. Beautiful building, absolutely beautiful. And you can read about the descriptions of it and imagine what it would look like when you read all of those things in the Kings and the Chronicles. Now, when Zerubbabel and the builders laid the foundation of the new temple and realized how poorly it compared with Solomon's temple, they wept. You can read about that in Ezra 3:12 through 13. However, that was just the foundation. When it was finally completed, the people celebrated, and they celebrated by keeping the Passover, and they turned their sorrow to joy because they had worked so hard to rebuild it. And that's in Ezra chapter 6:19 through 22. I've got a few minutes that I want us to look at the leadership of Ezra and some of Nehemiah, and we'll dismiss. So Ezra chapter 7 is a jump by nearly 60 years, and this is, even though the book is named for him, we don't run into him in the narrative until 60 years after the beginning. We don't really know what happened in the intervening years between Zerubbabel and Ezra. Ezra left Babylon in about 458 BC, and he brings a second group. Remember, the first group was 50,000, 50,000. The second group is 1,500, so 1,500 exiles return with him in Ezra 8:1 through 14. Ezra was a high priest, and his job was to fully restore the people, spiritually speaking. The Persian Empire, much like the Roman Empire, and I suppose even to a degree you could say we do here in America, embraced all religions. And that attitude trickled into the Jewish way of thinking, even though the law of Moses said not to, expressly forbade it. Many of the men married non-Jewish wives. And the reason God didn't want them to marry non-Jewish wives is because likely they were going to be pagans. They were going to worship idols. There are exceptions. Ruth is an exception. She begins to worship the true God. Rahab's an exception. She also worships the true God. There are others, but by and large, it's not going to happen, and because they're going to take you and they're going to convert you to paganism, or at least make you complacent concerning paganism, and so part of Ezra's work was to persuade these men to actually divorce their foreign wives because they were keeping them from becoming the kind of people that God would want them to. Now, that's a difficult thing. What we see, though, interesting enough, many of them actually did do this. They did do what Ezra commanded them to do. And then, after the restoration of people spiritually, the narrative begins to focus on Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the walls. So Ezra deals with the rebuilding of the temple, the restoration of the spirituality of the people. Nehemiah deals with the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, and that is in Nehemiah chapter 1 through chapter 7, verse 3. Walls were very important around cities back in those days. The fact of the matter is, we still see walls around countries. We have gated communities, and even if we don't want to focus on actual physical walls, we still have things in our computers, whether it be on a personal computer or all the way up to government computers. You got firewalls, and on top of firewalls, why do we call them walls? Because they protect from invasion. And so it was very important for Jerusalem to rebuild the walls so they could protect themselves from raiders and all kinds of things. Now, most books of the Bible are written from the perspective of a third person. However, Ezra and Nehemiah are written from perspectives of first person. Ezra refers to himself several times in chapters 7 through 10. Nehemiah refers to himself over 100 times in the book of Nehemiah, which is actually a very vivid account of his courage to overcome difficult odds to finish the reconstruction of the walls around Jerusalem, because others had attempted to rebuild the walls, but they had failed for over 100 years, almost 100 years anyway. People had tried to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem, but they'd all been unsuccessful. So we'll take a couple minutes here. The lesson is going to be a little bit longer than normal today. Um, so please bear with me, or you can pause and pick it back up when you get a chance. Nehemiah lived in the capital of the Persian Empire, known as Susa. He had a very important occupation, I guess you could say, in the king's office. He was part of the king's administration. He was the cupbearer. Now, a cupbearer is very important, a very high position in the court, because he tests the food, he tests the drinks that come to the king. You have to have someone that you fully and completely trust in that position, because it'd be an easy way for an assassin to get in and take out the king and cause all kinds of problems. So this is what Nehemiah was. So we already were, just by implication, we know the relationship that he has with the current king of Persia, with the current emperor. His brother, Nehemiah's brother, Hanani, visits him from Jerusalem and tells him of the terrible conditions that are still back there. And so Nehemiah came up with a scheme, but it would be difficult to do on his own. He would need a lot of help from the king of Persia. So, at great risk on his part, he asked the king for some time off, and he asked for supplies to help rebuild the walls. And that's exactly what the king, now Artaxerxes, let him do. So, obviously, these two men had a very strong relationship. Otherwise, it's unlikely Artaxerxes would have been that generous. And of course, they would have had to have a strong relationship based upon the job of Nehemiah anyway. The king gave Nehemiah four things rather. He gave him as much time off as he would need. He gave him letters of authorization for any building projects that were required, which was very important. If you read Nehemiah, you'll see why. He gave him all the timber, so all the wood that was required for the projects. He gave him those, and he also gave him military protection. So he had military going with him to protect him on his journey. Now, Nehemiah was a great planner, and that's one reason he was such a good leader. He planned, and you read about that in chapter 2, verses 1 through 8 of Nehemiah. He planned out his ideas before he even went to the people. His first task as governor, after being appointed as governor, was to go and survey the walls, what was left of the walls around Jerusalem, for 3 nights in a row. He did this secretly. Once he did, he told them what his plan was, told the people what his plan was, and they said, "Let us rise up and get to work. Let us rise up and build." However, as any good story, it's not going to be that easy, because we're also introduced to 3 villains, whose names are Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. That's in Nehemiah 2:19. At every turn, they were attempting to impede the Jews' reconstruction efforts of the wall. But because of Nehemiah's strong leadership skills and God's help, the walls were still rebuilt despite their opposition. In Nehemiah chapter 3, verses 1 through 32, every man and woman who participated in the rebuilding of the walls are listed. It may be boring reading, but it's pretty neat to think that these men and women that we don't know anything about, never heard of them before, they don't ever show up again in the scriptures. More than likely, none of them do. But they are listed alongside of men like Nehemiah, who helped to rebuild Jerusalem. It's how important they saw this. They completed the walls. What took 100 years to not be able to be done, the people rebuilt the walls in 52 days. Less than 2 months. The Bible tells us why in Nehemiah 4:6, because the people had a mind to work. Don't ever miss the significance of that phrase. The people had a mind to work. My mom used to tell me all the time, you can do whatever you set your mind to. I've not always believed that because I didn't believe in myself, but if we set our minds to something and we work for it, we're going to be able to do it, especially with God's help. Now imagine what a group of people can do if they set their mind in unity. That's the great thing about the church. We are supposed to be one in God. We are supposed to set our mind upon the same things. And so I want us to really think about that phrase as individuals, as a body of believers. They were one, they were together, they set their minds to work. Now Sanballat was a bully. He tried to trick and bait, even threatened Nehemiah, intimidated him, tried to intimidate him anyway, into making lapses in judgment or a mistake in leadership, but Nehemiah didn't even give Sanballat the time of day. He didn't ignore him, but he didn't even pay attention to Sanballat. That's how you deal with bullies. A lot of times bullies will try to goad you into giving them a response, and then they will try to trip you based on that response. But just because they're goading you doesn't mean that you have to answer them in like fashion. Nehemiah refused to. In fact, each time, on 4 different occasions, Sanballat tried to get Nehemiah to meet with him, I'm sure for nefarious reasons. Nehemiah said, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. I want you to think about that phrase too. He says, why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? As Christians, we're doing God's work. We're doing great work. Don't stoop down to the level of others who hate us. Let them hate. Let them be filled with anger and malice. Let us be filled with love and the purpose and the mission that God has given to us today, and has given us as long as we live. I'm sure that made Sanballat very angry, but he also had fear because the walls were finally completed in Nehemiah 6:16. Jerusalem was fortified again, and with strong walls to protect it and a strong leader, they would soon flourish under Nehemiah and his brother Hanani. Nehemiah was a praying man. In fact, there's 5 or 6 prayers, 6 I believe, in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah 1, 5 through 11, 2, 4, 4, 4 through 5, 4, 9, 6, 9, the second part of 6, 9 anyway, and 6:14. Nehemiah also displays himself as a man of faith. Says that he gives God the credit. God frustrated their plans. Nehemiah 4:15. Our God will fight for us. Nehemiah 4:20. This was accomplished with the help of our God. Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 16. And the final section of Nehemiah 7:14 through 13:31 it really serves as a grand finale to the entire book. All 3 leaders that we've talked about tonight, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, are mentioned, also along with a host of names of Jews who came back to their home. These people were just ordinary men and women. They didn't have any miraculous abilities. They just knew what needed to get done, and they set their mind to do it. They may have been considered heroes, but they were just being obedient to God's will. We can still do the same thing today. We don't do things to be heroes. We just get it done because it's what needs to get done. I want to thank everyone for listening this evening. Hope you all have a good week, and we will see you soon, Lord willing. Bye-bye.